Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on Being Human Conversations. This is our last webinar for the year, and I'm really excited about today's topic. This is something that has been on my mind for most of this year, and I wanted to bring it to you. And I will have a lovely guest with us today, Zamo Mbele, who is a colleague of mine, and he will be speaking to us about men's mental health. So please feel free to post any questions that you may have. Questions will be anonymous, and we will have a Q&A towards the end of the session. So we will be online for about 45 minutes. The conversation will go on for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions and we will close it off for the year. So really excited to have everyone, and and I've really had a great year with every one of you. Maybe some of you it's the first time joining. Glad you're here, but for some of you who've attended some of the webinars, I'm really grateful that you have been following us the past couple of months. We are at the end of the year, can't believe it. It is November, and it's tools down in about 6 weeks' time. So I hope you're all looking forward to the break. All right, so I suppose let's get into it, and let's chat to Zamo Mbele, who is a clinical psychologist based in Johannesburg. He is also doing some really exciting stuff at the moment with Panda Health, and maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about that. But yes, let's hand over to Zamo. Hi, Zamo. Thank you so much for making time to meet with me today. I know how busy your schedule is, so really appreciative that you could make it this evening.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for having this very important conversation.
Perfect. Maybe, Zamo, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you're up to at the moment?
Sure. I suppose I kind of start by saying that before this year, I was predominantly in clinical practice for about a decade and a half, and I worked in the public service and for most of my career, starting off at Chris Hani Baragwanath, which is the biggest civilian hospital in the world. And that was great to gain some unique, valuable experience. I then moved to Tara Hospital, where I just wanted to gain a bit more speciality and practice as a senior supervising, teaching and training psychotherapist. I've also worked in private. I have a small private practice at the Wits on Gordon, as well as I've worked in the NGO NPO space. I am still currently the vice chair of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. And I kind of say that to say my historical professional career has been in working with mental illness and helping people get better, though also working across the public mental health space, or private, public, and NGO mental health space. And now what I'm doing a lot more of is working in a proactive kind of critical mass health space. I work for Panda Health, and I am the chief clinical officer at Panda Health. And my role there is to look after clinical operations. And really what we do is, both in terms of a B2C, business to consumer model, we try and offer free, accessible, high quality, proactive mental health material. Though we also have a B2B component that optimizes with industry companies and businesses for their people's development as well. So that's who I am, and that's where I'm at currently professionally.
All right, great. I think that your bio, as you've shared it, really just helps the audience understand that you're the perfect person to speak to, because you have quite a diverse range of experience, clinical experience, in both private and public. And I think that this conversation really is important for both settings. So perhaps let's get into it, Zamo. I think men's mental health is an area or topic that I feel is not spoken about enough. And I think that there's a lot of awareness that needs to be put out there around, the different mental illnesses, mental issues, what we experience. And I think earlier on you spoke about mental illness and I think mental wellness. And I think that that's also quite an important distinction to make throughout this conversation. But perhaps, Zamo, can you tell us a little bit about, in your experience, when we talk about men's mental health, what are we looking at? What's the prevalence of mental illness in men? What are the stats saying? What's the research saying? And what are these type of mental health issues that men face? Zamo there? Is there it's probably load shedding? It often happens at this time of the evening. For those who are in South Africa, I'm sure you can certainly relate to this experience. So we'll just give Zamo a few seconds to jump back on. I'm sure he will just in a bit. And we will kick off our conversation. But in the meantime, if you have any questions around men's mental health, please do maybe just pop them into the chat box, and then we will show them throughout our conversation. And I'll try and get Zamo to answer the different questions. And just if you feel like you want to also share your experiences, please feel free to just share, because I think that the whole point of this conversation really is to open up a dialogue, a very important dialogue about men's mental health. What are these issues? What are men struggling with? And how can we support men in their mental health journeys? Because I think that there are a lot of taboos. There's a lot of taboo around men speaking about what their struggles are, and about men opening up in their own circles and with other people. And I think that it's on different levels. I would say it's more of a personal as well as an interpersonal dynamic, where and societal level actually, which makes it very hard for us to really engage and show some compassion to what men out there are struggling with. So let's maybe just give Zamo a few more minutes. Just excuse me, I'm just going to check on him to make sure that he is joining. He says he is in just now. All right. Let me just check to him. All right, I am back. I've just been chatting with Zamo. He has been load shed and he's restarting his internet and he will join shortly. But perhaps let me just sort of share something that he actually pointed to in his introduction around, the difference between mental illness and mental wellness. Because I think there's often a conflation of the two, but there's quite a difference in that mental illness, as Zamo will share, some of the illnesses that he has encountered when working with men is it's all the clinical disorders, whether it's depression, anxiety, or trauma, substance use, substance addiction, etc. But mental wellness is a bit different from that, and it's important to understand that the absence of mental illness doesn't necessarily equate to mental well-being. So just hold that in mind as we have this conversation, and perhaps you can reflect on where you are at on the mental health spectrum. All right, Zamo, are you back? Is that you?
You know, I'm terribly sorry. I'm back on my phone. I'm hoping my internet will reboot in a second. Though I was very well aware that we were live, so I thought to kind of just do something makeshift, even if it's for a little bit. Um, I'm just thinking what might be best. I'm obviously kind of coming in as you were discussing the because I left when you were, I think, wanting to invite me to discuss the difference between wellness and illness, and to get into it. And I suspect you've kind of gotten into it. Or where am I?
Yes, yes. So I just had that as a hanger for our audience to just hold in mind as we have this conversation. But maybe Zamo, let's get into it then. You tell us about what your experience has been, in your private and public sector when working with men and when we're talking about mental illness and mental wellness with men. What's the prevalence? What are the stats saying? And what's research saying to us and experience?
I mean, I guess if I kind of answer it in two maybe short ways, though the two direct ways, what I would say is, which is the following. I think that the difficulty is that a lot of men do not know what men's mental wellness looks like or is, because I think a lot of them are make reference to mental illness. So I think it's very, or perhaps it may be striking for a lot of people to hear that what we associate masculinity and maleness with oftentimes is very um, actually ill or symptomatic behavior. And of course, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to pick very stereotypical and glaringly so examples, such as men don't cry. Well, we know that that's a symptom of male depression, actually as well. Or boys are tough, and we know that the absence of vulnerability is itself a symptom as much as it is a big contributor to a whole host of masculine difficulties, or even something around boys will be boys, which is related to aggression, playfulness, which is irresponsible and dangerous in particular, and particularly promiscuity. All three of those, again, being kind of symptomatic or telling of something having gone wrong. So I guess what my first point is, I'm not certain that men can easily have a conversation around mental health, because whenever
Mm.
we refer to what is typical male or masculine, we actually are referring to something that's illness. So the second point that I also wanted to make, which is also concerning, is that you know, working as a clinician and having had to have good oversight around research because of my academic responsibilities in the work that I used to do and currently still do, what's become so glaring to me is that what we refer to as standard norms for mental wellness and illness is actually missing half of the population, which is men. And the
Mm.
shorthand of what I'm saying is it's a history, and a tragic one, that you have a bunch of men who wrote about what psychology and psychiatry is by only observing women. And so it is not surprising that specifically, for example, the symptoms of anxiety and depression in men, which are very typical as they are in children and geriatric populations, and we know the distinct features of those differences, is that is missing when we speak about what is depression, anxiety. You could speak to even a seasoned clinician, and when they refer to what depression, anxiety is, there's a misunderstanding or lack of awareness that they're referring to female adults depression and anxiety, not male, not children, not the elderly. And so, the problem here becomes that we haven't actually studied male psychiatry and psychology, and we would almost need to begin from the beginning. And of course, that's extreme because we do have some information and empirical around variance of presentations, variance of prognosis, variance of causality and correlation. Though, nevertheless, I think when we consider it as variance, we haven't understood that and that male psychiatry and psychology looks different, which is very scary actually to consider. And this is not to make men unique or special. I think it is to rather appreciate that the current situation is messed up because of men, because of this propensity for men to look outside and not imagine that they too would have a difficulty. And it's resulted in the absence of sufficient information around the treatment or the presentation of maleness. So it's very difficult to speak about the differences between male illness and male wellness, when my first point says what we consider to be well in maleness is actually not so well, and that's disseminated in society, and and my second point around how we've studied maleness and so on and so forth is, or how we've studied psychology and psychiatry has been exclusionary of maleness as well. But Titi, I'm just going to try and hop back onto my laptop. So I want to use this as an opportunity, and I'm so very sorry for this, though, in a bid to try.
Okay. I think Zamo is doing the switch over onto his computer. But I think that what he's just sort of shared, for me, it's making me think. I hadn't even gone that far around the history of psychiatry and psychology and how research around mental illness and mental wellness for men is missing. And I suppose what I'm also hearing him say is he's speaking something to the effect of the impact of society, and how society has also positioned men and how society views men, and the expectations, societal expectations, surrounding masculinity, emotional vulnerability, the stigma surrounding men expressing themselves, as well as how this results into men emotionally repressing their feelings and emotions, or suppressing whatever experience that they go through. And I think that what's also quite interesting is how he said part of the lack of research or information is also this, oftentimes this external gaze into the other, that this is what's happening out there, but it's not happening inside of me as a man. So I imagine then that must be quite hard as a man to start thinking about what is going on for me internally. And Zamo mentioned, I think that the viewers will be familiar with these sort of tropes of men don't cry, a man must be tough, a man is stoic, which suggests that men actually lack the capacity of emotion, which I think that is one of the biggest fallacies I've ever heard, is that, men lack emotions, which is absolutely not true, because men, women have the same brain and we all sit with emotions. So, but Zamo is here. So Zamo, you were speaking about how, men perhaps struggle to really look within and try and figure out what wellness means and for them and what it looks like. But so in your experience, when we talk about, depression in men or anxiety in men, how does that usually manifest?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to clarify because I think that part of also what has been unhelpful is then further maligning men by saying, oh, this is and of course I think men must be held to account. And though I'm looking at it from a clinical position, and I think to say men struggle is absolutely true, though it may be more accurate to say men have never really been helped or taught, and men do not help nor teach how to do all of that. And it's, I refer, in fact, because I know that my statement is going to be perhaps a bit complex in its loadedness, as in it's a bit controversial rather than complex, is that I refer to Bell Hooks, who just speaks about the fact that the current kind of um, masculine problem is both, well, now I have to rewrite Bell Hooks because she was writing in her time. The current masculine problem, or the problem of masculinity, is an all gender problem and an all
Mm,
sexuality problem, and not just a male problem. And so things like, of course, they struggle to access internal worlds is very true, though I think it's even too advanced than an awareness of an internal world and then a
mm,
practice of accessing. And I think conversations like this, to the extent that you have male speaking, are very helpful. And I also think that to the extent that you have males who are listening and participating, that's very helpful to do. I think that more than anything, um, it would probably also be helpful to do it in with young boys and girls,
mm,
um, probably in the most effective way. And therein would lie, if I heard you correctly, any kind of unique suggestion of how to attend to this.
mm,
Uh, the best answer would probably be something like, we probably need to be better fathers, we need to be better dads,
mm,
to all children, and father better children so that they can be better adults in the world. Though I think that's even too ambitious and generous, because in order to father, you oftentimes need to be fathered. And that's not to
mm,
say that you need one father and your father and so on and so forth. And I think that's really missing in the world, particularly in South Africa. So we can't go with that, right? I think perhaps then what we can go with is a recognition that this is a big problem and we need to start at a sustainable point. And I think the start from, especially the work that I've been fortunate to do through child and adolescent teaching and supervising, I think the work is absolutely through starting with children, um,
mm,
and working with them, and really at that very impressionable, and as you and I and most people know, critical age and stage, really trying to to help them, and then eventually help society through helping them.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, and Zam, I think you're speaking about a really important topic when you say we need to be better fathers as men. But in order for you to be a better father, you need to have the experience of being fathered. Can you maybe speak a little bit more about that, about the impact of men being fathered and men who have not been fathered? What does that sort of presence of a father figure and absence of a father figure do to a man's psyche?
A lot, and it's so risky. I have to tread the balance, and I'm going to try to do it dialectically, that we can hold two truths, right? One
Mm,
truth is
mm,
that the absence of something does not doom you, nor sentence you, and the something that is absent is, once again, a complex matrix of different things, right? On
mm,
the other hand, the I think that one of the societal ideas that have really been unhelpful is that you can do it all by yourself, and that is men, women, young, old, boys, girls, work, relationships, friendship. You can't, or you
mm,
can. You rarely can. You really, really can. And it's then probably not so beneficial and helpful to you. So I'm digging myself a bit of a hole, and hopefully my answer is going to climb out of it by saying it's complex because we have to consider what one is missing. And it's also complex because to be missing an actual human being who is male in your life does not make a father at all.
Mm,
So somewhere in between, we have to find an uncomfortable truth that sits in reality. And I think an uncomfortable truth, I think. So I say that to pronounce two things: my opinion, and where I refer to empirical evidence or research I will do and make references I will do. And secondly, I think it's much more conceptual at this point, and I may shift my position even after I say what I'm about to say. I think that I think that there has been something in a broader society that says fathers don't really need to father, and children do not need fathers. And I think that has been a result of very many things. I can only focus in this evening for a South African contemporary and historical context and say it occurred to me a while ago that the absence of fathering in South Africa, and that includes where fathers are present in the home, though it refers to, for example, I think that in our society, in the same way as the police or law and order has become ineffective, I think it represents something symbolic around the absence of a paternal function, which
mm,
usually fathers have and exercise. In our society, the absence of compassion and the presence of high violence and crime tells me that there must be an absence of something in our individuals that says this is wrong and this is how you behave. And then I think, lastly, in our society, the absence of individual responsibility taking to the other, and for further controversy, because I've already dug myself a hole in, as exampled by a state that is not accountable to its people, no fathering, as in generous with what. So I've given three kind of examples when I say South Africa is missing a father, and therefore I can go on and say I think the reason South Africa was missing a father, which is not atypical to other places in the world in different times, was that the idea of a father was either completely erased and
mm,
corrupted. Excuse me, the idea of father was either completely erased or it was corrupted. And where it was corrupted was a father state that was not a true father. It was not just, it was not prohibitive in substantive ways, and it was not, it didn't provide for its people. And if we call that the kind of, well, the historical father or white father, then I think a lot of men inherited this idea that to be a father, you can be, you can exercise injustices and you can be corrupt. You actually
mm,
don't look after home and those that you have a responsibility and duty for, and you can get away with anything. I suppose that's
mm,
part of the corruption. You don't give your family what, and you're also not held accountable, right? You're
mm,
all powerful. And you know I'm speaking relatively euphemistically, though I think there is an idea of a contemporary father which actually oftentimes actually looks very acceptable in society, that is a very powerful and probably too powerful to ever be challenged by anybody else, which is not true authority, right? And
mm,
exercising its authority in authoritarian way, which is tyrannical and fascist and not good. It doesn't provide. It actually doesn't give people what they need, least of which is water. And it also it corrupts itself and it becomes difficult to see what good and bad is. So that's one
mm,
fathering we get. The second fathering is absent fathering. And I think the history of this is when you have a generational population, and I think two generations of men who are called boys or treated as boys.
mm,
I think that there's a high chance and a probability that they really psychically strip themselves
mm,
of an identity and an idea of being men, and they behave like boys. And what boys do is probably best captured by artists around the folly of youth, actually,
mm,
and the lack of responsibility. And they, and, it's not all bad. The absence of youth means we probably don't explore enough, we don't risk enough danger, da 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 da. Though thank goodness youth have parents, though
mm,
youth didn't have parents. It had boys, it didn't have fathers, it had boys. And I think the children of those boys themselves have behaved and continue to behave like boys. So I've been a bit damning, a bit political, and a bit philosophical. But the psychology that I'm trying to refer to is I think there's an absence of fathering in our current contemporary society. If I look at South Africa, I think the
mm,
absence of fathering is because what has been taught and put forward and exampled around what father is not good. It's corrupt, it's too abusive in its power, and it's not nurturing. And the other idea of fathering is absent. It
mm,
doesn't take itself or consider itself seriously as a father, and it doesn't even have a reference point to say, oh, this is who and what fathers are. And I think between those two, I think very horrible ingredients, we have a horrible cocktail of absent fathering, and we really do need to start from the bottom up, ground up, and try to like design, develop what fathers are.
mm, mm. I mean, I suppose, Zama, you're also speaking about, there can be a presence, a father who's physically present, right? But a father who is emotionally absent and cannot father in the way that they need to father. And I imagine that that also does have an impact in young boys, as you've said, and how what they internalize about their own being and who they are internally.
Both for mom and dad, I imagine, yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And then Zamo, then how? I mean,
I mean, I want to
so
be a bit like a further, like like something that's also like societal is like how um and this is like the mixture of good and bad. I think how oftentimes boys are taught, oh no, don't do that. That's not boys things, right? Both by mom and dad,
mm,
um, and 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 how that's such a benign thing.
mm,
Oftentimes it's coming from love, actually, right? And so in that regard, it's actually almost like it's not as though and that's why I say you got a corrupt father and then you have an absent father. It's not as if you're not being taught how to be a father. You're being taught how to be a father or a man. It's just not true or good, actually.
mm, mm,
Anyway, I interrupted you.
mm, mm. And I suppose no, that's absolutely fine. I suppose it then brings me to perhaps why a process like a therapeutic process is so important when one is trying to work through their identity as a man. And can you maybe share a little bit more about how you work through some of that stuff for men, like in terms of figuring out your own identity as a man in light of the context that we have.
Yeah. And again, I think I want to position myself as, well, I suppose I would like to position myself as like neutral or agnostic, though I do have skin in the game. And the skin in the game is to say that I had a thought, for example, last year that it would be so incredible if a man would go through paternity coaching. And really what my idea was is that a lot of men, like, a lot of men, I can't even say it because it's not, a lot of men become fathers, but they don't actually become fathers. There's something I think incredibly helpful, transformative, and magical around pregnancy for 9 months, because I think that it does offer you an opportunity to become a mother,
Mm,
and a 9 months contemplation of becoming a mother. Though a lot of fathers are husbands, maybe one night, and then the next morning, dads or fathers. And there isn't a process of becoming a father, and all of the work that needs to go on there. And, the trope that moms and daughters have a strange relationship is probably better off, even though it's a trope, because at least they have a relationship. And the strain that the two of them may be experiencing in the relationship is something about the relationship working and them working through something. And the absence of that trope about fathers and boys probably says that there's an absence of a working through, as you were referring to, something, or a working out something, which is related to becoming a father. Um, I guess what I'm describing in my way is that my sense is that the work would be not to take for granted um, that you just become a father, and an appreciation that it is a becoming thing. It is metamorphosis in a way, and how can one be deliberate in becoming a father?
Mm, mm,
And
mm,
that's engaging, I suppose, something of a process, which would look, I think, very different for different people. Though engaging something of a process that says, okay, cool. If this doesn't happen overnight, what are the points of contemplation that one needs to do in order to prepare for this and become it?
mm, mm. I mean, that's fascinating, Zama, because I hadn't even thought about that, about the process of becoming a father, and how we expect fathers to be fathers, and yet there's almost like a step that perhaps they haven't been privy to in some ways, not entirely, but in some ways, and there's almost an opportunity there that maybe we have been missing when it comes to men. But I think that there are a lot of expectations, societal expectations, that we place on men or demand from men that, at times I do wonder whether we're missing some of the stuff that you're speaking about. And earlier on, you were speaking about the different tropes in society, right? That are often associated with men, etc. We spoke about the myths. Men don't have emotions, and the one sort of um, topic that I've been curious about. I mean, it's also quite complex, but I'm just going to simplify it. Is just also how it feels to me that there's often a depiction of men in extremes. It's either the far end of the spectrum, which is a toxic masculinity, or the good boy, the nice guy sort of position. And I suppose maybe can you speak a little bit to those two positions, ends of the dialectic, and what each position holds, and if at all there's a cost to just sitting in those two positions for me.
Cool. I mean, I'm gonna fumble because I'm just gonna kind of speak to it and say I mean my sense is to not be very generous with men. So and I know up until this point I've said, oh, it's not all men's fault, and it's not. Though I think that considering the privilege that men have had and held, I shudder to be
Mm,
perhaps even necessarily generous. So that's an important thing to say because my answer is not generous. And to say where men have been depicted in extremes, it's been by men. There hasn't been a state where literature or art in the main, art, both I think nouveau and mainstream, has been run by women. Not ever, not even close. So what we
mm,
have and see must be a result of men. And so then we have to be curious, why would men do this? And I think that it goes back down to something very primitive and very ordinary and very complex, which is the rivalry of men. That on television, and I dare you to do this experiment, on television, in books, in radio, podcasts, you either see the man that is winning, and oftentimes you either see the man that's winning or the man that's been castrated through shame or not having. And if I get a little bit kind of technical here, or just bloody strange, you see the Oedipal situation. where the extremes of the depiction of men are something very valuable around the idioms that men use to move through the world. It's either you're dominating and you're the absolute best and you're on top of it, um, or you are being dominated and then you're the absolute worst and you're and I think that the extremes that we're seeing is much more actually the extremes of male psyche. And put in a very different way, if nice guys finish last, um, or the jocks, as and I think that's what you're referring to, kind of in a graphic trope, I think is the only two fighting chances men give themselves, and I suppose fighting wasn't deliberate, though it's a very useful way to put it, because I think that men are constantly in a conflict between are they dominating or are they being dominated, which is such a limited position to hold because there's so much in between and there's so much even outside of those two binary choices. So you can see how those choices have either made men exceptionally ambitious and even sometimes materially successful politically and economically and socially and otherwise, or it's made them indulge consciously and unconsciously the idea of being social outcasts and socially undesirable and enact that through violence and neglect of self and others, amongst other ways. So I think the extremes that we see in the depiction of men is a male problem. I think it reflects how men move through the world. It's either you're being dominated or dominating, and it's not hard to imagine that if those are your only two options, you're going to work as hard as possible, as fast as possible, to be the one that's dominating
Mm.
all situations before you can. And anyway, and I think that it's such a pity because there's so much more uh, inside and around those two limited options. Mm.
Mm. I mean, Zama, that paints a very complicated picture. Um, when it then comes to men navigating interpersonal relationships, be it friends, be it romantic relationships. And I suppose I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are there then. How do men navigate those relationships given those two extremes?
I think they have two options. There are many options. One has many options at any given point. Though I think the two become apparent. It's either you just go with it, right? And you just go, geez, I mean, what option do I have? And you either play along and you pretend to be a man. And I must say, as mocking as it sounds coming out of my mouth, I really have no intent to mock. I think that to pretend to be something and to act like something is probably better for your life than to be nothing. Because that's the second option, right? Is to recognize that actually there's a lot to be lost, grieved, and said goodbye to before you could even imagine to say hello, design, or create something.
Mm, mm. Say a little bit more about the grief. What needs to be given up? What do you need to mourn in that process?
I mean, it would have to be, I suppose if I kind of keep it in an overarching, it would
Mm,
be either the absence of maleness and fathering that no doubt one would have experienced, or the presence of a very corrupt idea of what fathering is
mm,
or being a man is. So you can see why to choose to kind of just go with it is so much easier than to say, actually, I'm going to grieve, I'm going to know, grieve and mourn the absence of a father, perhaps so I can know the father that I can have or be. I'm going to grieve and mourn the absence of true maleness so that I can find my own. Or I'm going to grieve and mourn the fathers that I did have because that wasn't good. And I'm going to grieve and mourn the males that I had around me because that wasn't good. Those two, which is one option actually, is just way more difficult than to say, I'm just going to pretend to be a man.
Why is it difficult to grieve and mourn?
Well, like for all of us, loss is hard,
Mm,
actually. And I think also like staying true to something intuitive from the inside versus something populist from the outside is even harder, actually.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, if I put it in another way, I've actually come up with a third answer. You would probably need a father or a male figure to guide you through that, to
Mm.
say, it's okay for you not to be dominant. It's okay for you not to be vengeful. It's okay for you to access, And I think that there aren't enough of those pairings that would make it easier or more possible.
Mm. I mean, that sounds quite sore. I mean, when I listen to you, I suppose I'm sort of sitting with the sense that, geez, this is a lot of work, and this is painful work,
Mm.
but needed work.
Yeah. And hence I kind of say, all being said around me being unkind to men, I also think that there's a sober truth that says, and what choice is there in the immediacy, like really what choice is there? So I think it is a little bit of both.
Mm. And Zamo, and you and I both will know this very well, that in our work, sexuality and sex, as if we were to put it that way, is absolutely central to the mind and the psyche. And can you speak a little bit about maybe men's sexual health and the complications around that? I suppose what I'm thinking about in my experience, what I've often seen, is just how difficult sometimes it is to speak about men's sexual desires, needs, and fantasies, because I often get the sense that there's shame around speaking about that amongst
Yeah.
men or by men for men.
Yeah, I mean, I would struggle to kind of give you something substantive, though. Maybe what I can say is that I I think that the difficulty men find with speaking about their sexuality, desires, intimacy, kind of, is something that you might have a unique experience with, because it would require a man to enter into a vulnerable, intimate conversation with you. And I'm not certain how, really, as in I'm curious, I'm not for today, though, I'll be curious how men would then experience you, both as the therapist who can help them. So perhaps interesting power differential, though also a female therapist. So can you help them? I'm not certain. Though I think that the nub of it would be um, the contrast is how easily men speak about sex and sexuality and desire and all those things amongst men. Because I think that on the one hand, they're not really speaking about it, which is important to say. Though I think that it's, again, in that kind of immediate swing of dominating. They're speaking about dominance with their peers, right? And if they
Mm,
speak to you about it, I think that there's something submissive around having to put on display their most vulnerable, not the most, though, a very vulnerable part of them that I think they would naturally really struggle
mm,
with. Men, if yeah, if we hold on to this idea of the unfortunate cycle men always imagine themselves to be in is either dominant or dominated. And look, I really don't want to make it seem as though that's it. I think it's also very complex. Though I think that it's quite quick to either move from, in one's internal world without any sense that it's happening, that I'm being dominated and I must do something about it, or I'm dominating and this is good and I must maintain it.
mm, mm. And Zama, we are left with about 5 minutes, but I wanted to maybe move along the mental health spectrum and speak about mental health issue, a crisis that I think we are facing, which is suicide. And I know that suicide impacts everyone. It's not gendered. It affects women, men, children, young age, old age, middle aged. But can you maybe educate us a little bit about suicidality or suicide in men and how what that looks like and how it's different perhaps from suicidality or suicide in women.
Sure. I mean, kind of I oftentimes say two things about suicidality and men, and I say one, it's very important for us to know that suicide affects, no, no, that's unfair. Um, Men are the most likely to be successful at a suicide. We lose more men to suicide than any other gender in a significant way, right? Um, and obviously you can imagine there's an entire podcast just around that. Though I think that we're not, I don't know, taking seriously enough that when I speak to a male audience, I always say, I always start this conversation by reminding you all that I'm speaking to the most endangered species, population-wise. Middle-aged men are more likely to suicide and to be killed and to die from health conditions. They are the most endangered species. And I think that's just important for men and women and I suppose non-binary, all of us to really hold on to. Men are most likely to die of suicide, and they are most likely to suicide. That's one. Number two is, um, I guess I say something very pet or very obvious that the violence of men's suicide is very much linked to the hostility and violence of men's depression, and it's such a pity that the ultimate kind of the crescendo is a suicide. Though there would have been so much hostility and aggression 8 out of 10 times, to be fair, that leads up to it. And I say this to try save a man's life and to say, that aggressive hostile behavior, which is not you, is probably a sign and a symptom that something is wrong. And because the signs and symptoms have oftentimes been written for populations not like you don't know that something is wrong. And the next time we will know that something is wrong is when it's too late. And so it's important for me to put it this simply and this clearly in a bid to try and reach men out there before it's too late. I think I've lost you and or I have been lost to you. I see there's a question from Tumela. I'm not certain if I'm kind of or hello colleagues. What are some of the common causes of mental illness in men, and what advice would you offer men who are looking to seek therapy? The common causes in a contemporary world are probably psychosocial stresses. It's a very difficult time to be an adult in the world today, and I think especially because of the unintended consequences of, let's call it, giving men roles and responsibilities, it's particularly difficult to be a man in the world today. And I think that I could rattle a whole host of causes or common causes to mental illness in men. Though I think for today, I want to keep it to psychosocial. I think that there's a lot going on psychosocially, which I think men are incapable of knowing, let alone admitting to a vulnerability around. And reluctance in seeking therapy is probably to engage that and to engage in that a lot more. So, I've come to a point, and Batetshi is going to kill me for saying this. Not everybody needs to see a therapist, actually. And therapy is not the be all and end all of any treatment. A clinical psychologist is quite a specialized professional, and most people are struggling with difficulties of everydayness. In fact, I sometimes also mention that the WHO mentions that mental illness is coping with everyday difficulties. There will be difficulties every day, and bloody hell, it would be so much easier if they weren't. So nevertheless, not everybody needs to see a psychologist. I think what men can do that can be, in addition to psychotherapy, can be something of a collective cohesion And I don't have time to go into today, though there's a lot of history, and I think it's easy to imagine that there used to be a lot more communalism, and even if it was gender-specific communalism, and that was better than nothing. And the absence of that, or the eradication of that, has been good, and it's come with terrible consequences. And when that no longer works, when hanging out with the boys, when playing sports with the boys, when even being in a cell group with the boys, when that no longer works, that's when you need to see a psychotherapist. Yeah. We're going to have to say goodbye, Batetshi. We've come to the end, though I'll allow you to say goodbye for us.
Yes, absolutely. I got kicked out there as you were speaking to the men. How symbolic. But I hope that, audience found this valuable. We have reached the end of our session, and I hope that people would have picked up some nuggets from our conversation in spite of the different interruptions. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Zamo, for making time and speaking about men's mental health in a very different way, actually, and very insightful way. And I think that people will have a lot of things to think about this evening. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the invite, and good evening.
All right. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.